Hollywood in the 1950s and 60s looked glamorous on the surface, but behind the polished red carpets and dazzling smiles hid a much darker reality. Some of the very stars people adored carried beliefs that today would shock you to your core. Imagine rooting for your favorite hero on screen, only to discover they were secretly working against equality off it. Want to know which icons carried disturbing prejudices? Let's pull back the curtain and see. John Wayne. When people think of John Wayne, they think of the ultimate cowboy, the fearless soldier, the all-American hero. But off-screen, Wayne was pushing an agenda that was anything but heroic. In the 1960s, he wasn't just opposed to civil rights, he was openly fighting against it. He described civil rights activists as communist agitators, even suggesting they were the ones creating chaos in America. Wayne's production company didn't just make movies, it enforced segregation. He ran Batjack Productions with a strict whites-only hiring policy. And when asked about the Civil Rights Act, Wayne wasn't shy about dismissing it as unnecessary. This wasn't just talk. In 1967, he physically assaulted a black journalist who pressed him on his views, an incident that's quietly buried in history books. Even his films carried his prejudice. During the making of The Alamo, he ordered script changes that erased Mexican fighters' contributions. Why? Because he feared the story would look like greaser propaganda. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was a calculated move to shape Hollywood's view of minorities. Wayne's power didn't end with his career. He put clauses in his will to stop any black or Native American actor from portraying him in future films. Only decades later were those restrictions overturned. The man who played larger-than-life heroes left behind a legacy steeped in exclusion. Not exactly the cowboy myth audiences bought into, right? Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford might have been hailed as the queen of Hollywood glamour, but her influence carried an ugly side that history often overlooks. Beyond the movie sets, Crawford used her power to keep people of color out of the spotlight. She belonged to elite Hollywood clubs that banned non-white members, and she didn't just join them. She fought to keep those rules in place. When it came to housing integration, Crawford wasn't shy about where she stood. She actively lobbied against it, using her celebrity platform to keep neighborhoods segregated. In her private letters, she used words that stripped people of their dignity, reducing them to stereotypes. These weren't just private thoughts tucked away in a diary. Crawford acted on them, using her board positions at major studios to block black professionals from promotions or key projects. Her behavior on set was no better. During filming in the 60s, she had black extras removed for standing too close to her. And she even had contracts with clauses that banned black actors from sharing her dressing room hallway. That wasn't insecurity. That was systemic exclusion written into legal agreements. Crawford also targeted rising stars, like Dorothy Dandridge, lobbying MGM to pull support for her Oscar nomination by calling her names that should never have left anyone's mouth. Behind her polished smile, Crawford was running her own campaign to limit opportunity for others. Her cruelty didn't stop with Hollywood either. She even funded a segregated orphanage in Georgia. The glamorous icon audiences adored was also a gatekeeper of prejudice. Crawford's fame wasn't just about style and power. It was about keeping others out. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston is remembered by many as Moses in the Ten Commandments and a proud face at civil rights marches. But the truth behind his activism isn't nearly as noble as people were led to believe. Studio records reveal Heston didn't join those marches out of passion. He joined because the studio pressured him to look good in the press. Behind closed doors, Heston worked against progress. He lobbied to cut references to slavery from scripts, preferring history to be whitewashed. When he co-starred with black actor Brock Peters in Major Dundee, he fought to shrink Peters' role, writing bluntly that audiences would never accept a black man as his equal. That wasn't just a bad comment. It was a deliberate attempt to erase a colleague's contribution. His donations tell an even darker story. Publicly, he appeared to support civil rights, But his tax records show he quietly funded segregationist politicians like George Wallace. He even backed Lester Maddox's campaign in Georgia while presenting himself as a progressive voice in Hollywood. Later in life, as president of the NRA, Heston carried on this performative tough guy stance. In Flint, Michigan, a majority black city, he brandished a rifle declaring, "From my cold, dead hands." It was seen as a direct provocation in a city already struggling with racial tension. The contradiction is staggering. On one hand, Heston played noble leaders on screen. On the other, he was undermining equality whenever the camera stopped rolling. His legacy isn't just complex, it's soaked in hypocrisy. Shirley Temple Black, America's darling, the little girl who sang and danced her way into the hearts of millions, grew up into a woman with political power. And Shirley Temple Black used that power in ways that shattered her innocent image. When she became a diplomat, newly released government records revealed just how far her prejudices extended. As a U.S. ambassador, she reportedly blocked African nations from entering the United Nations, calling them uncivilized. She vetoed aid packages to majority black countries, claiming money for them was a waste. And her private letters made it worse. She floated plans for segregated schools in African nations, as if colonial policies belonged in the 20th century. In Ghana, where she served as ambassador, Temple reportedly enforced apartheid-style rules inside her residence, making sure black staff could not use the same bathrooms as white employees. State Department memos documented her remarks about African diplomats, dismissing them as savages who needed discipline. Even her humanitarian work was tainted. At UNICEF, Temple blocked advertisements featuring black children, fearing they wouldn't appeal to donors. She diverted funds meant for African relief to European programs, framing it as investing in civilization. For someone who spent her childhood embodying innocence and hope on screen, her actions as an adult tell a different story. Temple wasn't just a product of her time. She actively pushed for policies that kept people of color excluded. The sweet little girl Hollywood adored grew into a figure who used real power to reinforce prejudice. Bob Hope. Bob Hope was Hollywood's eternal jokester, the man who made troops laugh through decades of wars. But his jokes came at a heavy price, and often at the expense of black soldiers and entertainers. His contracts with the USO included shocking clauses. He would perform separate shows for white and black troops, ensuring segregation stayed alive in military entertainment. Behind the curtain, Hope's behavior was worse. Former writers revealed how he loved performing blackface routines at private Hollywood parties, long after the act was widely recognized as offensive. He laughed it off as tradition, but those jokes dehumanized entire communities. When he went on his legendary tours, Pentagon records show he flat-out refused to perform for integrated units in Vietnam, brushing it off with the chilling line, "I know what my audience wants." What he meant was clear. He was pandering to racism. Hope's fame gave him influence, and he used it to silence critics. FBI files show he even paid off civil rights groups like the NAACP to cover up his racist comments, ensuring his clean image stayed intact. That wasn't comedy. It was calculated damage control. Bob Hope may have been the king of one-liners, but the punchline here is brutal. While millions adored his humor, he was actively working to keep audiences divided. Behind the smile and the golf club, there was a man using laughter as a weapon to uphold prejudice. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's image was one of vulnerability and charm. Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, the girl who just wanted to get back home. But peel back the Hollywood magic, and a disturbing pattern emerges. Garland's relationship with race wasn't innocent. MGM payroll records show that black dancers in her productions were paid less than their white counterparts, sometimes by as much as 30%. That wasn't an oversight. It was discrimination baked into the system. Her personal behavior was even more damning. Accounts from the early 1960s describe Garland hurling racial slurs at Sammy Davis Jr. during an argument. That wasn't just a bad day. It was part of a bigger pattern. Studio memos from The Wizard of Oz reveal she lobbied to make the Wicked Witch's appearance look more like Harlem Negroes. It sounds absurd now, but in her mind, that was her version of realism. On set, she went further. In The Harvey Girls, Garland had a black dancer fired for merely touching her costume, and she refused to go on stage for a 1961 performance until black audience members in the first rows were moved elsewhere. That wasn't insecurity. That was outright prejudice, enforced by stardom. Her former maid later revealed Garland forced her to wear gloves inside the house so she wouldn't stain furniture. Behind the vulnerable screen persona was someone who used power to belittle and exclude. Garland wasn't just a troubled star. She was an active participant in Hollywood's culture of racism. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas built his reputation as the fiery rebel of Hollywood, the man who defied the blacklist and stood tall in Spartacus. But when it came to race, Douglas was no champion of progress. His clash with co-star Woody Strode, one of the few black actors in a major role at the time, revealed his true attitude. Strode later admitted Douglas demanded his billing be smaller and fought against giving his character a heroic death scene. Douglas wasn't worried about story. He was worried about a black man being elevated above him. Off-screen, his prejudice showed up in everyday life. House staff reported he kept black employees separated and referred to them as the help instead of names. When civil rights marches were gaining steam, Douglas mocked them privately, dismissing them as circus shows. Politically, he was even more contradictory. While publicly praising democracy and freedom, FBI files later revealed Douglas secretly donated tens of thousands to Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign, the one built on opposing the Civil Rights Act. He used his wealth to keep inequality alive while putting on a progressive front for fans. In real estate, he took things even further. Douglas bought properties in Brentwood and resold them with whites-only clauses intact. That wasn't passive racism. That was active gatekeeping of entire neighborhoods. Hollywood loves to remember Douglas as the man who defied studio bosses, but his real defiance was against racial progress. He wasn't just part of the system. He helped design the walls that kept people out. For a man who loved to play heroes, his off-screen reality looks anything but noble. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra's image as the smooth crooner, the Rat Pack leader, and even a supposed ally to black entertainers like Sammy Davis Jr., has been romanticized for decades. But documents and eyewitness reports paint a different picture. Sinatra wasn't the progressive ally he pretended to be. Hotel contracts tied to his performances reveal that Sinatra actively enforced racial exclusion. Black headliners were often barred from top billing at the very venues where Sinatra performed. That wasn't oversight. It was systematic gatekeeping. Then there was his infamous temper. A 1965 police report described how Sinatra assaulted a black photographer while unleashing a storm of racial slurs. And this wasn't a one-off. Insiders who worked with him described a long history of using demeaning language toward black staff and employees, all while presenting himself as Hollywood's friend to the underdog. Behind the scenes, Sinatra wasn't opening doors, he was shutting them. While he did help certain individuals rise, his power was used just as often to enforce the same racial hierarchies he claimed to despise in interviews. The contradiction was sharp. The man who sang about love and heartbreak was also a man who quietly worked to keep whole communities sidelined. Sinatra's legacy may still sparkle with the glamour of Vegas and Hollywood, but the story behind the velvet voice shows something darker. The so-called progressive was just as much a gatekeeper as the rest. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis loved to call himself the clown of Hollywood. But the comedy that made millions laugh came at a cruel cost. His routines often leaned on blackface, caricatures, and demeaning portrayals that weren't just offensive. They were institutionalized. Paramount archives show that Lewis vetoed the inclusion of black children in his annual telethons, until the late 1960s. Imagine that. The man raising money for sick kids refused to let black children appear on screen. The prejudice didn't stop there. Court documents from a 1967 lawsuit revealed Lewis paid black crew members far less than their white colleagues, sometimes only half the going rate. That wasn't comedy. That was economic discrimination. Lewis carried his act onto the stage, too. In 1963, at a packed Copacabana show, he performed a 15-minute blackface routine filled with watermelon jokes, earning roaring applause from a segregated crowd. And in his memoir drafts, he described Richard Pryor using slurs that audiences today would recoil from. His contracts also carried shocking terms. Southern TV stations airing his shows were allowed to cut to commercials whenever black performers came on screen. That was written into agreements, proof that this wasn't just personal bias, but built into his professional empire. Lewis's antics are remembered as silly and lighthearted, but for many, they were reminders of being mocked and excluded. The man who built his fame on laughter left behind a paper trail showing how his comedy helped keep stereotypes alive. Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford played tough but charming leading men, the kind of figure audiences rooted for in westerns and dramas. But off-screen, his actions revealed a darker side. During his divorce proceedings in 1959, testimony surfaced that Ford banned black guests from his home. One account even described him yelling at Sidney Poitier to get off my property when the actor stopped by a Hollywood party. His racism didn't stop at the front door. Studio records show that in his film contracts, Ford inserted clauses banning black actors from sharing scenes with him. It wasn't paranoia. It was pure exclusion written into business agreements. On set, his prejudice sometimes turned violent. While filming Cimarron in 1960, Ford reportedly broke the nose of a Mexican extra, sneering about the man's background in front of the cast and crew. Reports like these didn't make the headlines, but they circulated within the industry. Politically, Ford was just as extreme. FBI files reveal he donated heavily to segregationist politicians and even funded private investigations into civil rights groups, dismissing them as communist fronts. His money didn't just buy influence in Hollywood. It propped up the very movements fighting against integration across America. Fans may remember him as the rugged everyman, but those close to him knew better. Glenn Ford wasn't just another star caught up in Hollywood's prejudices. He was a man who fought to keep those prejudices alive. Richard Widmark. Richard Widmark built a reputation as Hollywood's intense villain, but his real-life actions were far darker than any role he played. On the set of Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, crew members recalled him yelling at a black extra to "know your place" after simply standing too close. It wasn't an isolated slip. It was the way he treated people consistently. Studio contracts show Widmark included clauses barring black actors from sharing his dressing room or participating in romantic subplots. He wasn't just cautious. He was enforcing segregation in paperwork. His gardener, a Mexican immigrant, even sued him in 1967, testifying that Widmark called him wetback trash and once threatened him with a gun. And it wasn't only personal. Widmark backed the John Birch Society, a radical anti-integration group. He hosted fundraising dinners for them at his home, showing that his money and influence were aimed at halting civil rights progress. A Life magazine expose reported he carried a whip on the set of Madigan in 1968 to keep Negro extras in line. If that sounds outrageous, it is. His private letters, later auctioned, called Martin Luther King Jr. a communist using slurs that can't be repeated. During the Watts riots, Widmark was overheard telling police to machine gun the whole jungle down. That wasn't tough talk from a character. It was his real belief. His scholarship fund even excluded black applicants until the 1970s. The on-screen villain act wasn't far from reality. Widmark lived his life playing a part, one that kept racial hatred center stage. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was hailed as the rebel of Hollywood, the man who challenged the system and spoke out for outsiders. But the legend of Brando as a progressive ally is more complicated than fans like to admit. Paramount Archives revealed that while he sometimes spoke out for Native Americans and civil rights, his private journals painted a different picture. In those journals, Brando described Martin Luther King Jr. as a media creation, dismissing the real struggle of civil rights as hype. Financial records uncovered later show he donated to groups opposed to interracial marriage, an astonishing contradiction for someone who claimed to stand with the marginalized. On stage and in interviews, Brando liked to project the image of a champion for justice. But behind the scenes, he sometimes refused to present awards to